The text from my husband arrived at exactly 10:52 at night. I was standing in the gilded lobby of the Saint Celeste Grand in New Orleans, exhausted and ready for my 3-day industry summit. The desk agent had just informed me Brett canceled my reservation less than 1 hour ago. Then, my phone buzzed in my palm. His message was cruel and short. Sleep in the lobby. You wanted this trip so badly. Figure it out. My name is Ariel Hollister. I am 38 years old, and for the past 5 years, I have worked as a sharp, meticulous contract compliance manager at Vantage Meridian Care Network. My daily professional life is defined by identifying irregularities. I study fine print. I hunt for hidden liabilities, and I flag disasters long before they have the chance to fully materialize. I am exceptionally good at my job. But as I stood in the glittering, chandelier-lit lobby of the Saint Celeste Grand in New Orleans, the heavy, humid air of the southern city pressing against the revolving glass doors behind me, I realized I had missed the most massive liability of all. It was sleeping in my own house, hundreds of miles away. I had arrived late for a 3-day national industry summit. My inbound flight had been delayed by over 2 hours. My leather travel bags felt unusually heavy against my shoulder, and the arches of my feet ached intensely in my professional heels. All I wanted in that moment was the quiet, predictable sanctuary of a standard hotel room, a blistering hot shower, and a solid hour to review my presentation notes for the following morning. I approached the polished mahogany front desk, smoothed the lapels of my navy blazer, and handed my identification and corporate card to a young clerk whose engraved gold name tag read Marcus. He offered a polite, practiced smile and typed my name into his computer system. A few seconds later, he frowned, his fingers pausing abruptly over the keyboard. He cleared the screen and typed my information again. The silence between us began to stretch, growing tight and profoundly uncomfortable. "I am sorry, Mrs. Hollister," Marcus said, his voice dropping to that hushed, cautious tone that customer service professionals use when they are forced to deliver highly unpleasant news. "It appears your reservation was canceled." I blinked at him, the sheer physical exhaustion momentarily clouding my ability to comprehend his words. "Canceled? There must be a system error. I am here under the Vantage Meridian corporate block. 3 nights, prepaid." "I see the original booking right here in the history," Marcus replied, his eyes darting nervously from his glowing monitor to my face. "But the system shows it was formally canceled less than 1 hour ago. The primary cardholder on file called our direct line to terminate the reservation." The primary cardholder, my husband, Brett Hollister. Before I could even begin to process the breathtaking audacity of that statement, my cell phone vibrated sharply in the pocket of my trousers. The screen illuminated the dim space around my hip. It was a new text message from Brett. I pulled the device out and read the words glowing harshly against the dark screen. "Sleep in the lobby. You wanted this trip so badly. Figure it out." He had timed it with absolute, predatory perfection. He knew my exact flight schedule. He knew precisely when I would be standing in this specific spot, tired, exposed, and expecting a seamless check-in process. He wanted me stranded in an unfamiliar city. He wanted me embarrassed in front of strangers. Most of all, he wanted me to feel the crushing, undeniable weight of his control. He wanted me to realize that my career, my ambition, and my physical safety only existed because he graciously allowed them to. He expected me to panic. He undoubtedly expected me to retreat to a corner of this grand lobby and call him, crying, begging him to fix the situation, and promising I would abandon the summit and fly home on the very first flight tomorrow morning. Instead of breaking down, something deep inside my chest shifted fundamentally. The heavy exhaustion vanished from my limbs, instantly replaced by a cold, quiet fury. It was not a chaotic, blinding anger. It was highly organized. It felt cinematic, as if a camera were pulling back to show me the entire scope of the battlefield for the very first time. I did not shed a single tear. I did not step away from the mahogany desk to make a frantic, pleading phone call. I simply looked up from my glowing screen and met the clerk's sympathetic eyes. "Marcus," I said, my voice perfectly level, completely devoid of any tremble or hesitation. "What is the absolute best room you currently have available for the next 3 nights?" Marcus blinked rapidly, clearly taken aback by the sudden, ice-cold shift in my demeanor. "Well, ma'am, due to the national summit, our standard and deluxe rooms are at full capacity. The only accommodation I have left in the building is one of our premium riverfront suites on the top floor. It is, unfortunately, quite expensive." "I will take it," I said without missing a single beat. I reached into the hidden zippered compartment deep inside my leather travel tote. Slipped beneath the fabric lining was a sleek, dark blue credit card. It was a high-limit emergency card I had opened entirely in my own name several months ago, tied to a private post office box, and never once used. Brett knew absolutely nothing about its existence. I handed the heavy plastic card to Marcus. He processed it immediately, the machine emitting a cheerful beep of approval. As he prepared my keycards, the compliance manager inside me fully took over. My brain bypassed the emotional trauma of a failing marriage and began operating strictly in the language of audits, timelines, and hard evidence. I opened the high-resolution camera application on my phone. First, I took a clear, sharp photograph of the digital clock mounted on the wall behind the front desk, establishing the exact time of the incident. Then, I subtly photographed Marcus's gold name tag. When he handed me the printed receipt for the new luxury suite and the official cancellation slip for the original room, I flattened both pieces of paper on the counter and photographed them from multiple angles. Finally, I took a pristine screenshot of Brett's text message, capturing his cruel words alongside the digital timestamp. I was not entirely sure why I was executing these actions in the moment. I did not fully grasp that I was actively preserving evidence. I only knew, on a deep, instinctual level, that documentation was power, and I would never allow Brett to twist the narrative of this night. Before putting my phone away, I opened my active message thread with my husband. I did not draft a long paragraph explaining my emotional pain. I did not ask him why he was trying to destroy me. I typed exactly one word: handled. I pressed send, locked the screen, and slid the phone back into my pocket. A uniformed bellhop escorted me to the top floor of the hotel. The riverfront suite was utterly magnificent. It was expansive and silent, decorated in rich velvet jewel tones with a sweeping, unobstructed view of the dark, rolling waters of the Mississippi River. The sheer, overwhelming luxury of the space stood in stark, almost laughable contrast to the public humiliation Brett had so carefully planned for me. When the heavy wooden door clicked shut behind the bellhop, I stood completely alone in the center of the lavish sitting area. I dropped my bags onto the floor. I waited for the inevitable breakdown. I waited for the hot tears, the trembling hands, the overwhelming, suffocating panic of realizing the man I married was an enemy. It never came. Instead, standing there in the quiet elegance of that massive suite, I felt something entirely unfamiliar wash over me. It was clarity, a sharp, brilliant, piercing clarity. For many months, perhaps even years, I had been suffocating under the heavy blanket of his supposed efficiency. Brett's constant financial management, his subtle daily put-downs, his tightening grip on the logistics of our lives, it had all been a slow-acting poison designed to keep me weak. But tonight, in his arrogance, he had moved too fast. He had shown his true hand. By trying to completely break me in that public lobby, he had inadvertently severed the leash. Distance from our shared house, distance from his commanding voice, and distance from the invisible walls he had built around me suddenly exposed the rotten structure I had been living inside. I walked into the massive marble bathroom, washed the travel grime from my face, and changed into the plush white robe provided by the hotel staff. I did not call my closest friends. I did not call my family to complain. I simply climbed into the exact center of the massive bed, the high thread count sheets feeling crisp and exceptionally cool against my skin. For the first time in many months, I slept deeply. It was a heavy, dreamless, restorative sleep. There was no anxious tossing and turning, no nameless dread gnawing at the edges of my consciousness. The monster was no longer hiding in the shadows of my home. He had boldly texted me his exact intentions, and somehow, seeing it in plain text made him entirely manageable. I woke up well before dawn. The large room was still shrouded in darkness, save for the faint, golden glow of the city streetlights reflecting off the dark river outside my window. I sat up in bed, feeling incredibly energized and dangerously sharp. Today marked the official start of the National Industry Summit. It was, without question, the biggest professional opportunity of my entire career. I had spent countless hours preparing a presentation that would place me directly in front of the top executive leaders in my field. Brett had tried to rip this triumph away from me. He had tried to reduce a respected compliance manager to a frightened, stranded wife crying by the lobby elevators. I swung my legs out of the bed and planted my bare feet firmly on the plush carpet. I walked over to the towering window and looked out at the slowly waking city. Brett Hollister thought he could effortlessly orchestrate my failure. He thought he held all the financial and emotional leverage. But he had forgotten one crucial, fatal detail about the woman he married. I was the person who managed the complex contracts. I was the person who tracked the corporate fraud. I was the person who always brought the receipts. He was not going to ruin this trip. He was not going to ruin my career. I watched the first pale, bruised streaks of morning light break over the New Orleans skyline, and I made a quiet, unbreakable promise to the glass. I was going to walk into that summit conference room, deliver the presentation of my life, and then I was going to go home and meticulously dismantle his entire world. As I stood by the massive window of the hotel suite, watching the dark waters of the river slowly turn the color of bruised iron under the pre-dawn sky, my mind began to drift backward. The adrenaline that had carried me through the lobby was beginning to recede, leaving behind a cold, hard space for reflection. How had I arrived at a point where my own husband would leave me stranded in a strange city at 10 o'clock at night? The terrifying truth was that Brett's control over my life did not begin with a slammed door, a raised voice, or a violent threat. If it had, I would have recognized the danger immediately and walked away. Instead, his control began with the softest, most comforting words a deeply exhausted woman could hear. It began with phrases like shared planning and financial efficiency, and let me take that off your plate. The invisible cage had been constructed exactly 5 years ago, during the hazy, sleep-deprived months of my maternity leave after our daughter, Wren, was born. I was recovering from a difficult delivery, nursing a colicky newborn around the clock, and functioning on perhaps 3 hours of fragmented sleep a night. My brain was a fog of exhaustion. One Sunday morning, as I sat at the kitchen island surrounded by stacks of paper utility bills and medical statements, Brett gently pulled the pen from my hand. He kissed the top of my head and suggested we merge everything. He argued that having separate checking accounts, separate credit lines, and separate tax files was needlessly complicated now that we were a family of 3. He offered to streamline our lives. He would set up a single master household account, handle all the incoming invoices, manage the online portals, and make sure everything was paid on time. I was so incredibly tired. I handed over my passwords, my routing numbers, and my financial autonomy with a profound sense of relief. I thought I was leaning on a partner. I did not realize I was handing over the keys to my own independence. When my maternity leave ended and I returned to the corporate world, my paycheck reliably hit the new joint account on the 15th and 30th of every single month. But almost immediately, the landscape of our marriage shifted. Brett controlled the banking applications on his phone. He controlled the 2-factor authentication alerts. If I wanted to log in to check a balance, a security code was texted to his device, meaning I had to ask his permission to view my own earnings. Whenever tax season arrived, he would slide a thick stack of printed documents across the dining room table, point to the sticky notes marking the signature lines, and tell me he had already reviewed the math with our accountant. I signed, I trusted him, but as my career began to accelerate, his resentment grew in direct proportion to my success. I was incredibly good at hunting down compliance failures and mitigating corporate risk. Every time I earned a promotion or secured a 10% salary increase, Brett would find a way to quietly minimize the achievement. Instead of celebrating, he would let out a long, heavy sigh. He would tell me that a new title just meant more stress for the exact same paperwork. He made sure I felt guilty for the late evening conference calls and the occasional weekend travel. Yet, he never once complained about the financial stability my rising salary provided. He happily drove the premium car my bonuses paid for, all while making me feel as though my ambition was a toxic burden on our household. If I ever dared to question where our money was going, or why our checking account balance seemed unusually low despite my recent commission payout, the gaslighting was instantaneous and breathtakingly effective. He would completely pivot the conversation. He would remind me about a pair of leather shoes I had purchased 2 months prior, or a slightly expensive dinner out with my colleagues. He masterfully reframed my logical, mathematically sound questions as irrational attacks. He told me I was impulsive. He told me I was highly emotional about standard cash flow fluctuations. He convinced me that I was simply bad with household economics, and that I should be grateful he was willing to manage the complex math. I believed his narrative for years, right up until a miserable Tuesday afternoon 7 months ago. It was raining heavily. I had picked up 4-year-old Ren from her preschool, and we were driving home on the interstate when my dashboard illuminated with warning lights. The engine shuddered and died completely on the shoulder of the highway. I called a local towing company, and a driver arrived 45 minutes later in the pouring rain. He replaced the dead battery right there on the wet asphalt. The total cost for the service and the part was $215. I thanked the man, pulled my debit card from my wallet, and handed it to him. He ran it through the portable reader attached to his phone. It declined. I felt a hot flush of embarrassment creep up my neck. I apologized, assuming the bank had flagged it for fraud, and handed him our joint credit card. He ran it again. It declined. The tow truck driver stood in the freezing rain, water dripping from the brim of his cap, staring at me with a mixture of pity and profound irritation. Ren was crying in the back seat. My hands were shaking. I called Brett, my heart pounding with panic, and explained the situation. His voice came through the speaker perfectly calm, perfectly casual. He told me he was moving some investment funds around, and the primary accounts were temporarily frozen for a security check. He told me to just use cash. When I told him I did not have $200 in physical cash sitting in my purse, he sighed heavily, as if my lack of preparation was deeply exhausting to him. I had to sit in my disabled car, with my young daughter weeping, and beg the wet, angry driver to wait 15 minutes while I called my younger sister to electronically transfer emergency money into my personal payment application. The humiliation was absolute. It tasted like ash in my mouth. The very next morning, on my lunch break, I walked into a different bank branch across town. I opened a private credit card in my own name, using my corporate office address for all correspondence. I hid the card in the lining of my travel bag. I promised myself I would never be left powerless on the side of a road again. After that incident, I started paying much closer attention to Brett's behavior. I noticed how aggressively he tried to discourage every single small investment I made in my own career. When I needed to pay a $400 registration fee for an advanced compliance certification, he argued with me for 3 days, insisting money was currently tight and the certification was unnecessary. When I purchased 3 new professional suits for this very conference, he walked through the living room, glanced at the garment bags, and muttered that I cared more about corporate vanity than our family savings. Worse, I began to realize he was actively curating a specific image of me to our extended social circle. At family dinners and neighborhood gatherings, he would adopt the persona of the patient, long-suffering husband. I would overhear him talking to his brother or our friends, speaking in low, confidential tones. He would say things like, "I just wish Ariel could disconnect from the office." He told them I was obsessed with the corporate ladder, and that he was doing everything in his power to keep our family priorities straight while I chased promotions. He was quietly, methodically preparing a version of me that made him look like the responsible, grounding force, while painting me as a neglectful, career-obsessed mother. He had built a perfect, insulated reality where he held all the power, all the money, and all the sympathy. But this trip to New Orleans was the one variable he could not control. This summit was not just another routine out-of-town meeting. It was the premier event in our industry. I was scheduled to deliver a keynote presentation on vendor risk failures to an audience of over 500 senior executives. This trip was my first highly visible step toward a regional director role, a position that came with a massive salary increase and a level of professional autonomy that Brett clearly did not want me to have. He knew that if I succeeded here, I would outgrow the financial cage he had built. That was why he canceled my room. That was why he told me to sleep in the lobby. It was a desperate, calculated strike designed to break my confidence, sabotage my presentation, and send me crawling back to our house, totally dependent on his grace. I turned away from the window, the morning light finally breaking across the hotel suite. The slow-building dread that had haunted my chest for the past 5 years was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating professional focus. He had tried to treat me like a foolish, impulsive wife. He was about to find out exactly what a senior compliance manager does to a fraudulent contract. I walked into the grand ballroom foyer of the Saint Celeste Grand at exactly 8 o'clock in the morning. I wore a tailored charcoal suit. My hair was pulled back into a severe, polished knot, and a heavy layer of expensive concealer masked the fact that I had only managed 3 hours of actual sleep. The air in the massive convention center buzzed with the low, steady hum of corporate networking and the clinking of porcelain coffee cups. I grabbed a black coffee from a linen-draped catering table, my blood practically vibrating with a potent mix of caffeine and a deeply controlled, white-hot anger. I was polished, I was prepared, and I was completely impenetrable. Before I could even find a quiet corner to review my physical flashcards, my department director, Dana Mercer, materialized beside me. Dana was a formidable, sharply dressed woman who did not believe in small talk or corporate pleasantries. She pulled me out of the main traffic flow and into a highly secluded alcove hidden behind several large decorative ferns. Her expression was completely unreadable, her jaw set in a tight, cautious line. She asked me how my flight was, and I gave her a neutral, highly professional answer about typical aviation delays. Then, she crossed her arms, leaned in close, and lowered her voice to a near whisper. Dana revealed that yesterday afternoon, just 2 hours before my flight was scheduled to take off, my husband had called her private office extension. He had bypassed the main receptionist entirely. He had played the role of a deeply concerned partner to absolute perfection. According to Dana, he sounded hesitant, profoundly apologetic, and sick with worry. He had gently suggested to my boss that I was currently going through a severe period of emotional instability. He claimed I was overwhelmed by household duties and irrational paranoia. He then asked Dana, point blank, if my attendance at this national summit was strictly mandatory, hinting heavily that the immense pressure of the cross-country travel might cause me to suffer a complete mental breakdown. The temperature in my veins plummeted to absolute zero. The canceled hotel room was not an isolated temper tantrum. It was not a petty, impulsive punishment for buying expensive conference clothes. It was the second phase of a highly coordinated, meticulously premeditated attack on my professional reputation. If I had arrived at this hotel last night, found myself without a room, panicked, and called Dana in tears to say I was abandoning the conference and flying home, I would have played perfectly into the exact narrative he had just planted on her desk. I would have looked deeply unstable. I would have looked entirely incapable of handling the high-stakes regional director role I was currently gunning for. He was actively trying to discredit me, paint me as a hysterical woman, and isolate me from my only source of financial independence. "Are you entirely all right to do this?" Dana asked, her eyes carefully scanning my face for any sign of the fragile, crumbling woman my husband had so vividly described. I looked her dead in the eye, my posture perfectly rigid, and told her I had never been better or more focused in my entire life. 15 minutes later, I stepped onto the elevated, brightly lit stage in front of 450 senior industry leaders. The small microphone clipped to my charcoal lapel picked up my steady, rhythmic breathing. The dark irony of my assigned topic was almost too perfect to bear. My presentation was an advanced masterclass on identifying vendor risk failures and exposing hidden corporate fraud patterns. For the next 55 minutes, I did not just deliver a standard corporate speech. I conducted a surgical, intellectual strike. I walked the massive audience through the exact anatomy of systemic deception. I explained precisely how bad actors exploit blind trust, how they manipulate authorization protocols behind closed doors, and how to spot the microscopic, easily missed cracks in a fabricated financial narrative. I detailed the red flags of unauthorized fund diversion and forged digital approvals. I moved across the stage with an electric, undeniable authority. When skeptical executives threw complex, aggressive questions at me, I answered them with rapid-fire precision, citing specific compliance laws and regulatory statutes. I channeled every ounce of my silent fury into my professional expertise. I was not just participating in the summit, I was dominating the entire room. When the session finally concluded, the applause was deafening and sustained. Dozens of vice presidents and regional managers immediately approached the stage, handing me their heavy cardstock business cards, clearly signaling that I belonged in much larger, higher-stakes environments than my current title suggested. I managed to politely excuse myself from the dense crowd of eager executives and retreated into the quiet, thickly carpeted corridor leading toward the executive suites. The adrenaline was still roaring like a freight train in my ears, making my hands shake slightly as I pulled my phone from my suit pocket. The digital screen showed a single missed call and a new voicemail from an unrecognized, out-of-state area code. Assuming it was a vendor following up on a question from my session, I pressed the phone to my ear and listened to the audio file. The voice on the recording was flat, administrative, and entirely unfamiliar. The caller identified himself as a senior compliance officer for a commercial lender I had never once done business with. He stated he was calling to urgently discuss the lapsed property insurance documentation tied to an entity called Blue Cedar Ventures Limited Liability Company. He specifically requested a call back from Ariel Hollister, stating I was the listed primary guarantor on the file. I stopped walking instantly. The heavy mahogany doors of the ballroom muffled the loud crowd noise behind me, leaving me in a sudden, suffocating silence. Blue Cedar Ventures. I repeated the words slowly in my head. I had never heard that name in my entire life. My thumb hovered over the screen, and I quickly opened my secondary, filtered email inbox, the one reserved solely for spam, junk mail, and automated banking alerts. I typed the strange company name into the search bar. A single message populated on the screen. It had been sent 2 days ago from a generic, automated address and was buried under a massive pile of retail clothing promotions. I opened the digital attachment. It was a high-resolution scanned copy of a formal delinquency notice. I zoomed in on the glowing screen, my eyes rapidly scanning the dense legal jargon. The document referenced a massive home equity line of credit. The collateral listed on the second page was the exact street address of the 4-bedroom suburban house I shared with Brett. The house we had supposedly almost paid off. The house where my daughter slept. My eyes darted down to the bottom of the digital page, zeroing in on the final signature block. There, rendered in stark, undeniable black ink, was my full legal name. The familiar loops of the letters, the sharp, distinct angle of my initials, the heavy pressure on the final, trailing stroke. It was a flawless visual match for my signature. It was perfectly executed on the bottom of the guarantee paperwork. Yet, standing in that silent, dimly lit hallway, my mind functioning with the hyper-clarity of a seasoned fraud investigator, I knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that I had never signed that piece of paper, not once. Not physically with a pen, and not electronically through a portal. My husband had not just tried to humiliate me by canceling a hotel room, he had forged my legal identity to leverage the roof over our child's head, to secretly fund a phantom business entity. I did not gasp for air. I did not drop the phone onto the carpet. I did not slide down the wall in a fit of panic. Instead, my compliance training took total control of my physical body. I executed 4 rapid, deliberate taps on my phone screen, forwarding the voicemail audio file and the attached digital document directly to the secret, heavily encrypted email address I had created alongside my hidden emergency credit card. I then permanently deleted the original notification from my device, systematically clearing the application cache so absolutely no digital trace remained for him to find. I took a deep, shuddering breath, smoothing the front lapels of my charcoal blazer until the fabric lay perfectly flat. A loud group of colleagues pushed through the double doors at the end of the hall, laughing and walking directly toward me. I pinned a bright, untroubled, highly professional smile onto my face. I turned to greet them, stepping forward into the light, fully aware that the marriage I had left behind yesterday was entirely dead, and I was now standing at ground zero of a massive financial crime. As soon as the heavy, soundproof door of my hotel room clicked shut, I dropped my briefcase onto the floor and dialed the only person on earth I trusted to hear the complete truth. Mina Cates was not the kind of woman who offered empty platitudes or warm, fuzzy sympathy. 3 years ago, she had navigated a brutal, scorched-earth divorce of her own, emerging from the wreckage with her assets intact and a terrifyingly practical worldview. I paced the length of the expensive riverfront suite, my voice dropping to a harsh, rapid whisper as I recounted the canceled reservation, the sinister phone call to my boss, and the forged delinquency notice sitting quietly in my encrypted inbox. Mina did not gasp. She did not interrupt to ask how I was feeling. She listened with absolute, chilling silence until I finally stopped speaking. Her first instruction was a direct command. Do not confront him. Do not ask a single question. Do not let your tone change. And absolutely do not let him know you have seen that loan document. She explained that men who meticulously forge financial paperwork are entirely reliant on their victims remaining ignorant and reactive. If I exploded in anger, I would give him the exact opportunity he needed to destroy the evidence, move the remaining funds, and spin my outrage as further proof of my mental instability. Mina then gave me the direct contact information for a woman named Evelyn March. Evelyn was a highly sought-after, deeply relentless forensic family law attorney based out of Richmond. She was known for dismantling complex financial deception with the precision of a surgeon. I called her office immediately. Evelyn listened to my brief summary with clinical detachment. When I described the scanned delinquency notice and the pristine forgery of my signature, the energy on the line shifted from a standard legal consultation to something far more serious. Evelyn explained the dire reality of my situation with zero sugarcoating. If my husband had indeed forged my signature to secure a collateralized loan against our primary residence and purposely hid those massive liabilities from me, I was no longer merely a dissatisfied wife standing on the precipice of a standard divorce. I was the primary victim of a major financial fraud. We were dealing with identity theft, bank fraud, and the unauthorized encumbrance of marital property. Evelyn instructed me to return home, act completely oblivious, and begin systematically gathering every scrap of paper I could find inside our house. 48 hours later, my return flight touched down. I drove my car from the airport to our quiet suburban neighborhood. Gripping the leather steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned completely white. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the entryway. The house smelled intensely of roasted garlic and fresh herbs. Brett emerged from the kitchen wearing a clean, casual sweater, holding a glass of expensive red wine. The transformation in his demeanor was so abrupt and complete that it genuinely made my stomach turn over. There was no trace of the cold, arrogant man who had ordered me to sleep in a public lobby. Instead, he was sickeningly sugary, deeply attentive, and practically vibrating with a false, desperate energy. He rushed forward to take my heavy travel bag, kissing my cheek and asking how my big presentation went. He poured me a glass of wine and guided me toward the dining room table, where a lavish, home-cooked meal was already waiting. He was backpedaling. He possessed enough base cunning to realize he had severely overplayed his hand with that text message, and now he was rapidly trying to smooth the waters, hoping his usual charm and pressure cycle would wipe my memory clean. He offered a practiced, sheepish apology over dinner, claiming he had been terribly stressed about household bills and had momentarily lost his temper regarding the hotel cost. He promised he would never let financial anxiety make him act that way again. I sat across the polished wooden table, chewing my food, sipping the dark wine, and looking at the man I had lived with for nearly a decade. I agreed with his flimsy excuses. I smiled softly. I told him I understood how stressful managing a household budget could be. I played the role of the forgiving, oblivious wife to absolute perfection, while inside, my blood ran colder than ice. I followed my standard weekend routine without deviating a single inch. I unpacked my suitcase, I did a load of laundry, and I spent the entire afternoon playing board games with Ren on the living room rug. I waited patiently. On Sunday morning, Brett finally announced he was taking Ren to the community park and then to the grocery store to pick up supplies for the upcoming week. He kissed my forehead, told me to enjoy a quiet morning to myself, and walked out the front door. I stood perfectly still in the foyer, listening until the heavy rumble of his car engine faded completely down the street. The house was completely silent. I walked directly down the hallway and pushed open the door to the home office. It was his sacred domain, a space dominated by a massive oak desk and two tall, locking metal filing cabinets. For years, I had respected the boundary of this room, trusting that he was handling our lives with the efficiency he always bragged about. I moved behind the desk and began opening drawers. The top drawers contained exactly what you would expect from a responsible adult: pens, paper clips, neatly sorted utility bills, and basic tax receipts. It was a perfect, boring facade. I dropped to my knees and examined the heavy bottom drawer of the desk. It was locked, but I knew Brett's habits better than he knew them himself. I reached under the rim of the heavy desk lamp, peeled back a small piece of decorative felt, and retrieved the tiny silver backup key he kept hidden there. The drawer clicked open. I pulled it out. It was packed tight with thick, unmarked manila folders. My hands moved with rapid, terrifying precision. I bypassed the folders labeled with our standard bank names and focused on the unlabeled envelopes stuffed near the back. I pulled out a thick, rigid envelope bearing the embossed logo of a regional title company. Inside, I found the finalized closing documents for a massive line of credit. My eyes scanned the dense paragraphs, confirming what Evelyn had suspected. He had leveraged the equity in our home to the absolute maximum legal limit. I dug deeper into the drawer. I found a stack of official state tax notices addressed directly to Blue Cedar Ventures Limited Liability Company. Tucked inside a seemingly harmless folder labeled with our daughter's medical records, I discovered a highly detailed, multi-year amortization schedule. It outlined a brutal repayment plan for a commercial debt we supposedly owed. Then, I found the operating agreement for the business. I spread the heavy, stapled packet across the leather blotter of his desk. I read the names listed under the corporate structure. Brett Hollister was listed as the managing partner. Right below his name was Candace Hollister, his younger sister, listed as the registered agent and primary administrative officer. My breath caught sharply in my throat. This was not a solitary betrayal. This was a coordinated family operation. His sister, a woman who had sat at my dining table and drank my wine on countless holidays, was actively helping him hide a massive financial enterprise while I was being scolded for buying work clothes. The most devastating detail was buried on the fourth page of the operating agreement. I ran my index finger across the printed text. According to the internal documents Brett and Candace had drafted, I was officially listed as a 49% managing member of the company. The sheer malice of the structure became instantly, horribly clear. He had spent years telling me we could barely afford daily life. He had systematically stripped away my financial confidence. Yet, on paper, he had secretly bound me to a massive, highly leveraged short-term rental venture. He had utilized my pristine credit score, my steady corporate income, and my forged signature to secure the funding. If Blue Cedar Ventures succeeded, he and his sister controlled the money. If the company failed and defaulted on its massive loans, the creditors would come directly after me, and the bank would seize the house where my daughter slept. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened the hidden camera application. I photographed every single page of the operating agreement. I photographed the title company envelopes, the tax notices, and the brutal amortization schedule. I made sure the lighting was perfect and the text was entirely legible. When I was finished, I carefully restacked the papers. I placed them back into their specific folders, returning every single envelope to the exact position I had found it in. I locked the heavy bottom drawer, wiped the silver key on my sleeve, and placed it perfectly back beneath the felt of the desk lamp. I walked out of the home office and closed the door behind me. I was no longer guessing at the shape of the monster in the dark. I had seen its face, I knew its name, and I was quietly, methodically building the cage that would destroy it. The heavy oak doors of Evelyn March's law firm were thick enough to block out the sounds of the busy Richmond traffic below. I sat perfectly still in a leather armchair opposite her massive desk, watching as she meticulously lined up 3 thick, cream-colored file folders. It had been exactly 14 days since our initial consultation. In that short span of time, Evelyn had deployed her first wave of subpoenas with the lethal efficiency of a military strike. The banks had responded, the digital trails had been illuminated. The complete anatomy of my husband's financial treason was now laying completely bare under the harsh fluorescent lights of the legal office. Evelyn opened the first folder and slid a consolidated bank ledger across the polished wood. She did not offer me a sympathetic smile or a gentle warning. She simply pointed the tip of her silver pen at a bolded line item near the top of the first page. It was a home equity line of credit, authorized and fully drawn down exactly 11 months ago. The total principal amount was $220,000. I stared at the spelled-out numbers until the letters began to blur and swim across the page. $220,000. For nearly a year, I had been sleeping under a roof carrying a massive, secret anvil of debt. During those exact same 11 months, Brett had repeatedly scolded me for leaving the air conditioning running too long. He had complained bitterly about the rising cost of our daughter's preschool tuition. He had made me feel guilty for purchasing a new pair of winter boots, insisting that our household budget required extreme discipline and painful sacrifices. All the while, he had $250,000 of stolen equity sitting in a shadow account. I swallowed the sharp metallic taste of bile rising in my throat and asked Evelyn where the money had gone. She turned the page. The subsequent bank statements painted a picture of grotesque, unhinged vanity. Not a single cent of that massive loan had benefited our household. It had not gone into college savings, or retirement accounts, or emergency funds. Instead, the stolen money had poured directly into the operating accounts of Blue Cedar Ventures. From there, it bled out into the world in the form of exorbitant promotional costs, expensive branding consultants, and high-end designer furniture purchases. Then, Evelyn's pen tapped against a recurring monthly charge. It was a staggering sum, paid on the first of every month, clearly labeled as a lease payment for a premium apartment in the downtown commercial district. My breath completely stopped. My initial reaction was deeply, fundamentally physical, an affair. The financial abuse was horrific, but the sudden visualization of a secret downtown apartment cut through me in a way the spreadsheets could not. I pictured another woman. I pictured him buying extravagant dinners, drinking expensive wine, and unlocking the door to a hidden romantic sanctuary while I was at home cutting coupons and nursing our child through winter fevers. The sheer humiliation of being the loyal, funding wife to a man keeping a mistress made my hands shake violently in my lap. Evelyn watched my face fall, instantly reading the trajectory of my thoughts. She raised a hand to stop me. She pulled a glossy photograph from the third folder and placed it gently in front of me. The image had been acquired by a private investigator Evelyn routinely used for asset verification. It showed the interior of the downtown apartment through a large, street-facing window. There was no bed, there were no candles, no romantic ambiance, and no evidence of a secret second life. Instead, the space was arranged like a sleek, ultra-modern corporate boardroom. There was a massive glass table, heavy leather executive chairs, and expensive abstract art hanging on the walls. It was a show office. Brett had not leased the apartment to hide a mistress. He had leased it to hide from his own mediocrity. He was using our stolen home equity to fund a lavish staging space, a theatrical set designed exclusively to impress potential investors and project the illusion of immense wealth. He was playing the role of a highly successful real estate tycoon downtown, while actively intercepting the very real, very urgent past due notices that the post office was trying to deliver to our suburban mailbox. Somehow, realizing that his ultimate mistress was his own bloated, fragile ego felt infinitely more pathetic and devastating than an actual physical betrayal. The sickness deepened as Evelyn moved to the mechanics of the fraud. Securing a line of credit of that magnitude required intense verification. It required a formal closing process, legal witnesses, and heavily scrutinized signatures. I asked how a bank could possibly process a loan against a jointly owned property without me ever sitting in a room to present my identification. Evelyn pulled out the final page of the closing packet. At the bottom of the page, right next to my impeccably forged signature, was a bright blue, circular ink stamp. It was an official state notary seal. The registered name on the seal belonged to Candace Hollister, his sister. Candace worked as a senior coordinator for a prominent commercial real estate closing firm. She processed complex property deeds and loan originations every single day. She knew exactly what she was doing. She had intentionally abused her state-appointed power to unlawfully rubber stamp my forged presence, pushing the fraudulent paperwork through the banking system without triggering a single internal security alarm. But Candace was not the only relative deeply embedded in the rot. Evelyn's forensic accountant had uncovered a web of secondary investments tied to the Blue Cedar operating accounts. Brett's father, Ron Hollister, had been quietly circulating the company prospectus at family gatherings. Ron had convinced several aunts, uncles, and cousins to invest their personal savings into the venture. The bait Ron used to secure their money was me. He had explicitly told the extended family that the business was incredibly safe because I was the primary financial guarantor. He used my prestigious corporate title, my unblemished credit history, and my reputation as a meticulous compliance manager to sell them a complete illusion. I was the unwitting shield protecting a family-run scam. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, feeling the oxygen thin out in the room. I thought I had reached the absolute bottom of the betrayal. I was wrong. Evelyn pushed one final document toward me. It was not a bank statement. It was an internal human resources form from my own employer, Vantage Meridian. It was a payroll routing authorization. 6 months ago, I had worked 70-hour weeks to finalize a massive, grueling compliance audit. My reward was a highly lucrative performance bonus, a sum of money I had proudly told Brett would finally give us a comfortable cushion for the winter holidays. But when the payout date arrived, the deposit had been significantly smaller than I anticipated. Brett had told me it was due to a severe, unexpected adjustment in our tax withholding bracket. I had believed him, frustrated but trusting his math. Looking at the form on Evelyn's desk, I saw the truth. Brett had logged into my employee portal from his computer at home. He had intercepted the digital routing process. He had meticulously altered the direct deposit instructions, siphoning the bulk of my hard-earned bonus away from our joint checking account and redirecting it straight into the hungry, failing jaws of Blue Cedar Ventures. That specific detail wounded me in a way the massive bank loan did not. It was a violation of my core identity. For years, Brett had relentlessly mocked my career. He had belittled my expertise, rolling his eyes at my dedication to rules, authorizations, and administrative security. Yet, behind my back, the man who openly despised my professional strengths had weaponized those exact same tools against me. He had used portals, compliance forms, and digital signatures to bleed me dry. He had used my own domain to execute his theft. I stared at the altered routing number, the ink black and damning against the white paper. The cold, quiet fury that had bloomed inside me in New Orleans suddenly hardened into something dense, heavy, and absolutely unbreakable. Up until this exact moment in Evelyn's office, my primary goal had been survival. I had only wanted to sever the financial ties, escape the marriage with my daughter, and protect whatever was left of my life. But looking at the organized, multi-layered conspiracy laid out on the mahogany desk, a profound shift occurred in my mind. Escape was no longer sufficient. Mere survival was an insult to the work I did every day. I looked up at Evelyn. I did not shed a single tear. I did not ask her how we could quietly settle the divorce to avoid public embarrassment. I asked her exactly what legal mechanisms we needed to deploy to ensure every single person whose name appeared in these folders was held to the absolute highest degree of legal and financial accountability. I stopped thinking about running away. I started thinking about exposure, absolute demolition, and making entirely sure that the truth could never, ever be spun away. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in silent execution. Under Evelyn's strict guidance, I systematically dismantled his access to my future. During my lunch breaks, I walked to a completely different bank branch across the city and opened a secure checking account. I placed a hard freeze on my credit profile across all 3 major reporting bureaus. I purchased a prepaid cellular phone with cash to handle my 2-factor authentication, entirely bypassing the family plan he monitored. I changed the recovery addresses on every single personal email account, deliberately selecting security questions to which he would never guess the answers. Before leaving the house each morning, I quietly slipped critical documents into my work bag: birth certificates, our daughter's passport, the original deed to our home, my social security card. By Friday afternoon, they were locked safely inside a steel deposit box at my new bank. When I returned home each evening, my behavior remained flawlessly unchanged. I cooked dinner. I asked him about his day. I let him initiate his familiar, suffocating cycle of subtle criticism and grandiose affection. He assumed his control was absolute because I had completely stopped resisting. I no longer argued about the grocery budget or questioned his late nights. I simply nodded, smiled, and let him believe he had successfully trained his wife to obey. The depth of the family's complicity became glaringly obvious during a Sunday afternoon cookout at his father's house. The backyard was filled with relatives holding plastic cups of beer and plates of grilled food. I sat in a lawn chair, watching my husband stand near the brick fire pit with his father, Ron, and his sister, Candace. He draped a casual arm around my shoulders and began talking loudly to his uncle about future property growth and leveraging local real estate markets. He squeezed my shoulder and smiled down at me, telling the group that we were looking at expanding our portfolio by the end of the 4th quarter. The sheer audacity of the performance was breathtaking. He was speaking as if I were a fully informed, enthusiastic partner in his phantom empire. Candace raised her glass in a silent toast, and Ron gave an approving nod. They were all in on it. They were actively using my physical presence to validate their fraudulent investment scheme to the rest of the extended family. A month ago, I would have been deeply confused by the conversation. Today, I simply took a sip of my iced tea, offered a demure, supportive smile, and logged the interaction directly into my mental vault. The deception was a group effort, which meant the fallout would be a group casualty. Monday morning, I arrived at my office an hour early. I had 2 critical tasks to complete. First, I drafted a formal, legally worded email to the corporate management office of the Saint Celeste Grand. I bypassed the front desk entirely and contacted their risk management department. I requested a certified copy of the digital phone log from the night of my arrival. Within 4 hours, a secure file arrived in my inbox. It contained a time-stamped record proving the cancellation call originated from my husband's exact cellular number, along with the desk agent's typed notes, confirming the caller explicitly instructed the hotel staff to provide absolutely no alternative accommodations for the guest. Next, I walked into the Human Resources Department at Vantage Meridian. With Dana's full support, I secured a formal internal incident report. It documented the exact time and nature of the phone call my husband had made to my boss prior to the conference. The document explicitly stated that he had attempted to interfere with a corporate event by framing his spouse as mentally unstable and unfit for travel. Later that afternoon, Dana called me into her glass-walled office. She closed the blinds and asked me to sit down. She did not ask about my personal life. She kept the conversation strictly focused on my value to the company. She informed me that my presentation on vendor fraud had caused a massive ripple effect among the senior leadership team. The executive board had officially placed my name on the final shortlist for the regional director role. It came with a base salary increase of 40%, a full executive benefits package, and total operational independence. It was precisely the kind of unshakable financial power he had been trying to choke off for the last 5 years. I looked Dana in the eye, thanked her for her advocacy, and promised her I was entirely ready for the responsibility. That evening, I drove to Mina's house. We sat at her massive oak dining table, the surface completely covered in printed documents, highlighters, and plastic sheet protectors. Mina helped me construct the weapon that would end my marriage. It was a heavy 3-ring binder, meticulously organized into chronological, tabbed sections. Section 1 contained the hotel sabotage and the false instability claims. Section 2 held the forged loan agreements, the notarized signatures, and the property liens. Section 3 documented the diverted bonus money, complete with the altered payroll routing forms. Section 4 exposed the hidden liabilities of Blue Cedar Ventures. I became terrifyingly effective because I had completely divorced myself from the emotional chaos of the betrayal. I stopped asking why he did it. I stopped wondering if he ever truly loved me. I simply stopped arguing and started documenting. Every time he told a lie at home, I silently added a page to the binder in my mind. The transformation was profoundly satisfying. I was no longer a victim reacting to his cruelty. I was an auditor preparing a final judgment. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place just before midnight. Evelyn had sent over a new batch of secured financial disclosures obtained from the commercial lender. Mina and I reviewed the balance sheets for his secret company. The numbers were catastrophic. Despite the massive injection of stolen home equity, the downtown show office, and the expensive consultants, the short-term rental market had shifted violently against him. Blue Cedar Ventures was bleeding cash at an uncontrollable rate. The documents showed 3 separate accounts that were over 60 days past due. A formal notice of default was actively being drafted by the bank's legal department. I closed the heavy cover of the evidence binder and leaned back in my chair. A cold, genuine smile spread across my face for the first time in weeks. My husband was not just an arrogant manipulator operating from a position of absolute power, he was drowning. The walls of his financial house of cards were rapidly collapsing, and he was desperately trying to keep the illusion alive while the bank prepared to seize everything. He was a cornered animal, and he had absolutely no idea that the woman he thought he had successfully trapped in the cage was actually the one holding the padlock. It started on a Tuesday evening, right around 7 o'clock. My corporate direct deposit, the one I had quietly rerouted to my new, secure account, usually hit the joint banking ledger on the 15th of every single month. He was sitting on the living room sofa, staring intensely at the financial application on his mobile phone. The harsh glow from the screen illuminated the sudden, tight pinch of his eyebrows. He looked up, his voice dripping with an exaggerated, syrupy sweetness. He asked if there had been a glitch with my office payroll, casually mentioning that my check had not landed in our usual account. I did not blink. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the television screen and calmly replied that Human Resources was currently migrating to a new software system, causing a slight, company-wide delay. He smiled, but the warmth did not reach his eyes. The probing had officially begun. To compensate for his growing internal anxiety, his behavior inside the walls of our house became nauseatingly perfect. He bought expensive flowers. He offered to cook dinner. He spoke softly. But outside our front door, he was aggressively accelerating his smear campaign. I knew this because the echoes reached me almost immediately. His sister, Candace, sent me a text message on Thursday morning. It was a long, highly invasive paragraph filled with heart emojis, claiming she was deeply worried about my mental stress. She wrote that my husband had confided in her about my recent reckless spending and severe emotional instability, and she just wanted to offer a quiet shoulder to cry on. It was a highly coordinated offensive. They were actively building a digital paper trail of my supposed mental decline to completely discredit anything I might say when their financial house finally collapsed. The true, staggering depth of their delusion was on full display during a dinner at a local Italian restaurant that weekend. It was supposed to be a casual family gathering. His father, Ron, leaned across the basket of breadsticks and loudly praised the recent operational adjustments at Blue Cedar. Ron looked right at me, raising his glass of red wine, and thanked me for being so heavily involved in the strategic planning of the business. He spoke as if I had personally approved every single step, as if I had enthusiastically mortgaged my own child's future to fund their vanity project. The absolute confidence they had in my perpetual silence was breathtaking. They truly believed I was too docile to ever push back. I simply smiled, raised my water glass in a silent toast, and offered a polite nod, letting them dig their graves a few feet deeper. The careful facade nearly shattered entirely exactly 48 hours later. I had brought home a thick, rigid envelope from Evelyn's law office containing the initial drafts of the civil fraud filings. I had carelessly left it tucked inside my leather portfolio on the kitchen island. I was standing at the sink, washing a coffee mug, when I heard the sharp, distinct sound of a zipper opening. I spun around. He was standing there, his hand hovering directly over the exposed edge of the heavy legal envelope. The air in the kitchen instantly vaporized. My heart slammed against my ribs so violently I thought the bone might crack. If he saw the law firm's return address, the element of surprise was completely dead. I moved with a terrifying speed, grabbing my portfolio and smoothly sliding it under my arm. I told him I had strictly confidential medical compliance files from work that absolutely could not be left out in the open. He stared at me, his eyes narrowing into cold, suspicious slits, but he slowly backed away. The tension in the house spiked to a suffocating level. He knew something was terribly wrong. That very same night, the pressure finally cracked him wide open. I lay awake in our dark bedroom, listening closely. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, I heard the heavy floorboards creak in the home office down the hall. I crept silently to the door and peered through the narrow gap. He was bathed in the harsh blue light of his computer monitor, his fingers flying frantically across the keyboard. He had a headset pressed to his ear, arguing in a hushed, desperate whisper with someone on the other end of the line. I watched him physically unplug external hard drives and shove them hastily into a canvas duffel bag. He was actively attempting to shift the remaining liquid funds out of the Blue Cedar operating accounts and into offshore holding entities before the morning. What he did not know was that Evelyn was a predator who always hunted 3 steps ahead. Days earlier, she had successfully filed ex parte preservation motions with the regional banking authorities. When he hit the digital transfer button in the dark, the transaction did not clear. It only partially executed before triggering a massive, automated security freeze across his entire portfolio. By attempting to move the money under the cover of darkness, he had generated a blazing digital flare. He had just handed my attorney undeniable, time-stamped proof of his intent to conceal marital assets, damaging his legal defense far more severely than if he had simply stayed in bed. The sheer panic set in by breakfast. His arrogant composure was completely gone, replaced by a frenetic, sweaty desperation. Right before I could leave for the office, he cornered me in the narrow hallway near the front door. He shoved a heavy clipboard against my chest. Clipped to the board was a single, dense page of legal text. He forced a wide, unblinking smile and told me it was just a simple cleanup document for our joint taxes, urging me to sign it quickly so he could mail it before noon. I looked down at the paper. My daily compliance training immediately flagged the broad indemnity clauses hidden deep in the second paragraph. It was a retroactive authorization form. In his sheer panic, he was trying to trick me into legally validating the forged home equity loan after the fact. I reached into the pocket of my trousers, my thumb pressing the side button on my phone twice to silently activate the voice recording application. "I cannot sign this right now," I said, my voice perfectly calm and steady. "I need to read it thoroughly. What exactly does this document authorize?" His face flushed a dark, angry red. The syrupy sweetness evaporated instantly. "Just sign the paper," he hissed, his voice trembling with a rage he could no longer conceal. "You never read this stuff. You always just sign it." "Why are you suddenly making this so difficult?" "Because I do not recognize the corporate entity listed in the second paragraph," I replied, holding his furious gaze without blinking. "I am not signing anything tied to a business I do not own." He froze completely. The clipboard slowly dropped to his side, the metal clip clattering loudly against his belt buckle. For the very first time in our entire marriage, I watched the absolute terror bleed through his arrogance. His eyes darted frantically across my face, desperately searching for the compliant, easily managed woman he had controlled for years. She was completely gone. The digital recording application in my pocket captured the heavy, suffocating silence of a man who suddenly realized he was trapped in a burning building with absolutely no exits. He finally understood that I was no longer manageable. The trap had officially snapped shut. The counteroffensive began precisely 1 week later with a thick stack of legal filings delivered by a private courier. My husband had retained an incredibly expensive, highly polished defense attorney, a man renowned throughout the city for transforming guilty men into tragic, sympathetic victims. Reading through their initial response brief felt like walking through a sickening, distorted funhouse mirror. The narrative of our entire marriage had been aggressively and violently twisted. According to this slick lawyer, I was not a victim of financial fraud or identity theft. I was a fully informed, deeply vindictive partner who had always been intimately aware of the short-term rental venture. The attorney brazenly argued that my current outrage was nothing more than a calculated divorce strategy, born out of my bitter resentment toward his powerful, close-knit family influence. To prove my supposed financial recklessness, the lawyer attempted to weaponize my survival against me. He submitted the massive credit card charge from my emergency stay in the southern city, painting me as an extravagant, impulsive woman who intentionally squandered marital funds on a luxury suite out of sheer spite. I sat in Evelyn's office, staring at the crisp white pages, a cold knot of genuine fear tightening in my stomach. For the very first time since this nightmare began, I felt my confidence waver. I realized that the absolute truth was not an impenetrable, magical shield. Inside the walls of a courtroom, the truth was malleable. It could easily drown under aggressive reframing, practiced half-lies, and masterful legal storytelling. I was terrified that a judge might actually believe their polished fiction. Evelyn, however, did not share a single ounce of my panic. She simply smiled a thin, terrifyingly calm smile and drafted our immediate rebuttal. She did not argue emotion. She argued raw, indisputable data. She legally reframed the expensive suite charge not as a luxury purchase, but as a direct act of emergency self-protection resulting from deliberate, premeditated spousal abandonment. Attached to her filing was the certified front desk log, the digital timestamps of his cancellation call, and a high-resolution, color-printed copy of his cruel text message instructing me to sleep in a public space. Evelyn's filing was a tactical masterpiece. It instantly transformed his defense from a plausible marital disagreement into a documented act of calculated malice. But the most grueling battles were not fought on legal paper. They were fought on the floor of my own living room. As the tension escalated, the emotional center of gravity shifted heavily onto the small shoulders of our 4-year-old daughter, Wren. She returned home from a supervised weekend visit with him, carrying a small canvas backpack and a deeply confused expression. She sat on the woven rug, carefully stacking her wooden building blocks. Without looking up from her toys, she innocently repeated a line she had clearly absorbed from the adults around her. "Mommy," she asked, her high, sweet voice echoing in the quiet room, "why does Daddy keep saying you do not understand business?" The question felt like a physical knife slipping between my ribs. It was an agonizing, breath-stealing kind of heartbreak. He was actively using our innocent child as a sponge for his toxic, fragile ego. The overwhelming urge to retaliate, To sit down on the floor and tell my daughter that her father was a liar and a thief burned white hot in the back of my throat, but I swallowed the fire. I completely refused to drag my daughter into the bitter, scorched earth wasteland he was creating. I took a slow, steadying breath, sat down beside her on the rug, and gently handed her a wooden block. I told her that business was just math, and that her mother was exceptionally good at math. Instead of fighting his ghost in our living room, I focused entirely on building an impenetrable fortress of predictability, calm, and emotional safety for her. I established rigid, comforting routines. Our home became a sanctuary of soft music, warm dinners, and absolute peace. That peace allowed me to maintain my intense focus at the office. My department director, Dana, became an unexpected, vital pillar of strength. She called me into her glass-walled office on a Tuesday afternoon. Instead of expressing concern over my complex personal life bleeding into my professional duties, she offered me unprecedented grace. She granted me entirely flexible work arrangements, allowing me to step out for urgent depositions or remote legal meetings without penalty or question. More importantly, she looked me directly in the eye and made it abundantly clear that my future at the company was incredibly bright. The regional director role was still waiting for me. Dana gave me a tangible, powerful reason to fight forward, proving that my identity was not defined by the man trying to destroy me, but by the career I had built with my own two hands. Still, the sheer, crushing weight of the litigation threatened to break my resolve. The constant barrage of aggressive emails, the endless financial audits, and the sheer exhaustion of living in a state of perpetual warfare took a massive toll. Late one evening, sitting at my kitchen island surrounded by mountains of legal paperwork, I completely hit a wall. I rested my forehead against the cool granite counter. My closest friend, Mina, was sitting across from me, drinking black coffee. I looked up at Mina, my eyes burning with unshed tears, and confessed that I just wanted to surrender. I told her I was tempted to sign whatever settlement they offered, walk away with nothing, and simply buy my peace. Mina reached across the granite and gripped my hands with an iron strength. She refused to let me entertain the thought. She reminded me that exhaustion was a temporary physical state, but regret was permanent. She forcefully pushed me to remember the canceled hotel room, the forged documents, and the stolen bonuses. She told me I had not come this far just to let a cornered man dictate the terms of my surrender. Her brutal, loving honesty kept me on my feet, just long enough for the entire landscape of the war to change. The new twist arrived on a Thursday morning via a highly urgent phone call from Evelyn. Her voice lacked its usual smooth cadence. It was sharp and laced with absolute triumph. The massive commercial lender holding the fraudulent mortgage had not simply stopped at reviewing our specific property file. When Evelyn's initial preservation motions flagged the forged guarantee, the bank's risk management division quietly initiated a massive, sweeping internal audit. They began pulling every single closing file that his sister, Candace, had ever touched during her tenure at the real estate firm. What the auditors found broke the case completely wide open. Evelyn explained that my stolen signature was not an isolated incident of marital desperation. The bank had identified highly suspicious notary practices, missing physical signatures, and phantom family guarantors on dozens of different commercial files processed by Candace. She had been using her state-appointed power to unlawfully rubber stamp highly leveraged loans for a massive, intertwined network of speculative ventures orchestrated by his father. The sheer scale of the deception was breathtaking. This was no longer just a messy, localized domestic dispute over a hidden rental company. The family scam was infinitely bigger, deeper, and more deeply rotten than my marriage had ever been. It crossed multiple state lines and involved millions of dollars in fraudulently secured capital. Evelyn hung up the phone, leaving me standing in the center of my quiet, safe living room, listening to the silence. A profound, bone-deep sense of vindication washed over my entire body. My husband had hired a polished attorney to paint me as an emotional, vindictive woman. He thought he was cleverly managing a private divorce disaster. Instead, he had unknowingly dragged his entire family to the absolute edge of catastrophic professional and legal ruin. The heavy oak doors of the regional family courthouse swung shut behind me at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning. The air inside the long corridor was stale, smelling faintly of floor wax and old paper. I walked beside Evelyn, my heels clicking a steady, rhythmic cadence against the polished marble floor. We entered courtroom number 4. He was already seated at the heavy wooden table reserved for the respondent. He wore a sharply tailored navy suit, a crisp white shirt, and a dark silk tie. His posture was perfectly relaxed. When I walked through the swinging wooden gate dividing the gallery from the well of the court, he turned to look at me. His expression was a practiced mask of condescending pity. He leaned back in his leather chair, exuding an absolute, arrogant confidence. He was entirely convinced that I would either crumble into a weeping, terrified mess under the harsh fluorescent lights, or that I would overreact and explode into a hysterical, unhinged rage. Those were the only 2 versions of me he believed existed. He had spent over half a decade carefully conditioning me to doubt my own reality, and he genuinely thought the immense, suffocating pressure of a formal legal proceeding would shatter my nerves completely. I pulled out a heavy wooden chair and sat down perfectly straight next to Evelyn. I did not fidget with my hands. I did not adjust my blazer. I did not look at him. I simply opened my leather portfolio, clicked my pen, and waited for the judge to take the bench. I was neither crumbling nor exploding. I was operating at absolute zero. The temporary hearing was not designed to finalize the divorce. It was designed to establish immediate boundaries, allocate temporary assets, and secure physical safety. Evelyn stood up to address the court. She did not raise her voice, nor did she employ dramatic, sweeping gestures. She functioned like a high-end corporate auditor presenting a catastrophic loss report. She laid out a disciplined, brutally chronological timeline for the presiding judge. She started with the hotel sabotage, moved to the false instability claims made to my employer, transitioned smoothly into the forged loan documents and portal lockouts, highlighted the deliberate bonus diversion, and finished with his panicked, late-night attempt to move liquid assets immediately after receiving legal notice. It was a suffocating wall of facts. To support the first pillar of the timeline, Evelyn submitted a formally notarized affidavit sworn by the general manager of the Southern Hotel. The judge adjusted his reading glasses and read the document silently. The affidavit explicitly detailed the phone call made to the front desk. It confirmed that the caller not only canceled the prepaid room, but specifically instructed the hotel staff not to assist the arriving guest under the original corporate authorization, ensuring she would be left entirely stranded late at night. The judge's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing sharply as he looked across the room at the defense table. The polished narrative of a simple, accidental cancellation instantly evaporated. It was undeniable proof of calculated malice. Next, Evelyn dismantled the financial theft. A senior payroll administrator from my corporate office appeared via a secure video link to testify. She was a dry, meticulous woman who answered questions with absolute precision. She explained the digital routing change that had siphoned away my massive performance bonus. She testified that the internal security logs showed the change was not initiated from my secure workplace terminal. Instead, she read the recorded Internet Protocol address into the court record. Evelyn then provided the billing statements from our Internet service provider, proving the address belonged to the desktop computer sitting in our suburban home office. The money had not been lost to a tax bracket adjustment. It had been actively hunted and diverted from his keyboard. The killing blow, however, came down to the forged signature on the massive home equity line of credit. His attorney had previously suggested that I had casually signed the electronic portal from my mobile phone while running errands, simply forgetting the transaction entirely. Evelyn destroyed that defense with metadata. She presented the digital footprint embedded deep inside the electronic loan package. The banking system recorded the exact, unalterable minute my supposed signature was applied. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon at exactly 15 minutes past 2 o'clock. Evelyn then handed the judge a sworn attendance log, corporate security badge swipes, and time-stamped video stills from my employer. At exactly 15 minutes past 2 o'clock on that specific Tuesday, I was standing in a glass-walled conference room 30 miles away, actively leading a live mandatory training session for 40 newly hired employees. My physical location was entirely indisputable. It was mathematically impossible for me to have signed those documents. The gravity in the courtroom shifted heavily when the attention turned to his sister, Candace. She had been subpoenaed to answer preliminary questions regarding her state notary stamp, which appeared on the final page of the fraudulent guarantee. She sat rigidly in the witness box, her face pale and drawn. When Evelyn asked her to explain the standard verification procedures she used to authenticate my presence on the day the loan was finalized, Candace did not answer. Instead, her independent legal counsel stood up and instructed her not to speak. Candace formally invoked her constitutional right against self-incrimination, refusing to answer any questions about the notary process to avoid criminal exposure. The silence that followed her refusal was deafening. It badly undermined the entire defense and clearly signaled to everyone in the room that the family's coordinated, fabricated story was rapidly collapsing inward. His expensive attorney desperately tried to stop the bleeding. He stood up, smoothed his silk tie, and attempted to reduce the entire mountain of forensic evidence to a simple, unfortunate marital misunderstanding. He argued that spouses frequently share passwords, manage assets fluidly, and occasionally step on each other's toes when managing complex family businesses. He tried to paint the forged documents as an administrative shortcut taken by an overeager husband trying to build a legacy for his family. The argument was worse than weak, stacked against the precise, documented malice Evelyn had just presented. It sounded deeply insulting. The judge had heard enough. He leaned forward, his expression hard and unforgiving. He did not issue a gentle reprimand. He granted me immediate, temporary exclusive use of our primary suburban home for myself and our daughter. He ordered the defense to completely vacate the premises by 5 o'clock that very evening, with a police escort if necessary. He ordered a massive, invasive forensic accounting of every single business entity connected to the family. Finally, he legally restored my total access to all critical records and unfroze the specific marital funds necessary for my daily survival. The hearing was over. I packed my leather portfolio, stood up, and walked out of the heavy oak doors into the bright, echoing hallway. I was waiting by the elevator bank when he pushed through the courtroom doors. The polished, arrogant act was completely gone. His face was flushed, his tie was loosened, and his eyes were wild with a frantic, unspooling rage. He marched directly toward me, ignoring his attorney's urgent commands to stop. He stopped 3 feet away, his chest heaving, and pointed a trembling finger at my face. He blamed me for the catastrophe. He hissed that I was vindictive, that I was ruining his life, and that I was destroying everything we had ever built. I looked calmly at the frantic, cornered man I used to fear. My voice was completely steady, devoid of any anger or sorrow. I did not destroy anything, I told him, the cold truth echoing sharply in the marble hallway. You destroyed it the moment you signed my name. The final hearing did not look like a television drama. It looked like an autopsy. After 9 grueling months of litigation, forensic accounting, and relentless subpoenas, the complete and unvarnished truth of Blue Cedar Ventures was finally dragged out into the harsh fluorescent light of the courtroom. The sheer scale of the deception was staggering to witness, even for me. Evelyn presented a towering mountain of evidence that stripped away every single lie my husband had ever told. The hidden leverage on our home, the forged legal guarantees, the deliberately misdirected income, and the fabricated narratives of financial ruin were all laid bare. The court saw clearly that the entire family operation was a hollow, rotting structure built entirely on the assumption of my perpetual silence. The collateral damage he caused his own family was absolute. Candace sat in the gallery, weeping quietly into a tissue. She had completely lost her professional standing. The state licensing board had permanently revoked her notary commission. Her real estate firm had fired her, and the commercial lender had officially referred her suspicious closing files to the state attorney general for a formal fraud review. Brett and his father, Ron, sat at the defense table looking hollow and deeply aged. The aunts, uncles, and cousins, who had eagerly poured their retirement savings into the venture under the false belief that my corporate salary was guaranteeing their money, had violently turned on them. The Hollister family was no longer a united front. They were a chaotic mob of angry, terrified creditors fighting over the scraps of a bankrupt dream. When the judge finally issued his ruling, his voice was thick with undisguised contempt for the defense. He slammed the gavel down on the absurd notion that the massive debt tied to the fraudulent home equity loan was a shared marital burden. He ruled definitively that the debt could not and would not be treated as my willing obligation. He legally severed my name from the liability, assigning the entire crushing weight of the repayment directly to Brett. The court then credited me for my full share of the home equity he had stolen, ordering it to be paid out from his remaining legitimate assets. But Evelyn did not stop there. She successfully secured full reimbursement for the performance bonus he had secretly diverted from my payroll portal. Furthermore, because the mountain of digital evidence proved a sustained pattern of deliberate concealment, financial abuse, and coercive control, the judge ordered Brett to pay my entire sum of attorney fees. In a final, desperate attempt to save face, Brett's lawyer tried one last time to shame me over the expensive riverfront suite in New Orleans, arguing that I was financially vindictive. The judge stopped the attorney mid-sentence. He picked up the printed screenshot of the text message Brett had sent me that night. The judge read the words out loud, his voice echoing sharply across the quiet mahogany courtroom. "Sleep in the lobby. You wanted this trip so badly. Figure it out." The judge explicitly cited that message in his final decree, stating that a man who calculates the public humiliation and physical endangerment of his wife forfeits any right to complain about the cost of her emergency self-protection. The very weapon Brett had used to try and break my spirit had become the exact shield the court used to protect my finances. The following Monday, I walked into the sleek, glass-walled offices of Vantage Meridian Care Network. I did not feel like a woman who had just survived a war. I felt like a woman who had won one. My department director, Dana, called me into her office and closed the door. She slid a thick, bound folder across her desk. It was the official offer letter for the regional director position. It came with a 40% salary increase, an executive expense account, and a massive expansion of my authority. I picked up the heavy silver pen sitting on her desk. For 5 years. I had conditioned myself to hesitate. I would have mentally calculated how Brett would react to the travel schedule. I would have prepared a careful, apologetic speech to soften the blow of my own success. I would have shrunk myself down to fit inside his fragile ego. This time, I did not hesitate for a single second. I signed my name with bold, heavy strokes. I accepted the role without asking permission, without apologizing, and without an ounce of fear. I used the first portion of my financial settlement to immediately clear the balance on the secret emergency credit card I had carried to New Orleans. Then, I began building a formidable fortress of real, untouchable savings entirely in my own name. We sold the suburban house that had been the center of the fraud, and I moved Wren into a beautiful, sunlit townhouse closer to my new corporate office. I spent weeks carefully curating our new space. I filled it with soft rugs, warm lamps, and massive stacks of children's books. I created a home that felt deeply calm, completely unmonitored, and entirely ours. One rainy Sunday afternoon, I was sitting on the living room floor with Wren, helping her build a complicated puzzle. She was quiet for a long time, her small fingers moving the cardboard pieces around the carpet. She looked up at me, her bright eyes scanning the quiet, peaceful room. She smiled softly and told me that our new house felt so much less loud, even when nobody was talking. That one quiet, innocent observation from my 4-year-old daughter landed harder and deeper than any triumphant speech delivered in the courtroom. The heavy, invisible static of anxiety, control, and constant surveillance was finally gone. We were breathing clean air. 6 months later, I walked through the revolving glass doors of a different luxury hotel in a different city for another national executive conference. The lobby was bustling with professionals, the air thick with the smell of expensive coffee and polished marble. I approached the front desk, smiled at the agent, and handed over my own corporate credit card and my own loyalty rewards number. My reservation was secure. My itinerary was flawless. As the agent handed me my room keys, I felt a profound, radiant lightness in my chest. There was absolutely no fear attached to any of it. Brett Hollister had thought he was a master architect of control. He thought he could manipulate my career, steal my resources, and leave me stranded in the dark with a single, cruel text message. He tried to teach me to sleep in a lobby. Instead, he forced me to wake up. I taught him that public records, infinite patience, and a meticulously prepared woman can take one arrogant mistake and turn it into the lesson he will never, ever forget. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please leave a comment below with your city or country so we can connect. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Helena Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people who might need it.